Here are the topics that will be covered in the President's Revision video. This is going to focus on how to use comparative theory in regard to the executive branch. Students have used the following three theoretical approaches to make a comparative study of government and politics of the UK and the USA, analysing and explaining similarities and differences between them. The three comparative theories are structural, rational and cultural. Structural theory focuses on the institutions in a political system and the processes within them. Rational theory focuses on individuals within a political system and the assumption that people will act rationally, whereas cultural theory focuses on the shared ideas and history within a political system or group. Let's start by looking at structural theory and how we can apply this to the executive branch. Firstly, we've got the fusion of powers, which means the UK Prime Minister and the government are part of Parliament. This gives a Prime Minister with a majority a far greater ability to influence the legislature than the President of the United States, as separation of powers limits the President's control. UK Prime Ministers can also rely on the payroll vote, whereas the US President cannot. Membership of the UK Cabinet means that key parliamentarians take collective responsibility for government decisions. This increases the Prime Minister's influence over selected individuals in Parliament. In the US, Cabinet Ministers are not part of Congress, and the US has a singular executive, whereas the UK has a system of cabinet government. The US President has a sole executive authority, whereas the Prime Minister is the first among equals, and all cabinet ministers take responsibility for decisions. The US President also benefits from a more extensive administrative support than the Prime Minister. There is also a different process for removal of office, which gives the US President far greater job security. It is essential for the Prime Minister to maintain support of the Commons, whereas a President who loses the support of Congress will continue in office, barring impeachment. The President is also the head of state, unlike the Prime Minister, and therefore has a greater ceremonial role to play. When we're looking at rational theory, which is the role of individuals acting out of self-interest, there are different areas that we can look at when considering the executive branch. We're going to start with this idea of responding to a weak legislative position, and I'm going to focus on the US President Barack Obama and the UK PM David Cameron. Cameron's Conservatives lacked a majority in Parliament from 2010 to 2015, so they formed a coalition government with the Liberal Democrats. Cameron therefore was highly focused on his cabinet during his first term. Without the agreement of both parties to Cameron's policies, the coalition would have ended, so his emphasis on collective decision-making was a rational response to the circumstances of a hung Parliament. Similarly, Obama lacked control of the legislature for most of his presidency. After losing the House in the 2010 midterms, the Democrats lost the Senate in 2014. However, whereas Cameron was able to forge an alliance with the Liberal Democrats and govern through a coalition cabinet, Obama rarely met with his cabinet as they had no ability to control Congress, so Obama had to use different strategies. His rational response was to use direct authority to govern. Obama used executive orders and executive agreements to avoid asking Congress to pass legislation or ratify treaties, as he knew that these would be rejected as they were controlled by the opposite party. When looking at rational theory, we can also look at how do prime ministers and presidents respond to a national emergency. And here I'm going to focus on US President George W. Bush and UK Prime Minister Tony Blair. Bush and Blair both found that their time in office was transformed by the 9/11 attacks. Bush declared war on terror and ordered the US invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, and then later on the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Blair believed the UK had a duty to support the US and became Bush's closest ally. Both leaders therefore maximised control during a time of war. Bush used emergency powers to authorise the extraordinary rendition of terrorist suspects and their detention without trial. Blair was accused of a presidential style of government in which he ignored his cabinet. Blair could dominate his cabinet in this way because of his large party majority in Parliament and strong support within the Labour Party. Bush and Blair knew that the public and politicians tolerate a more assertive style of government and foreign policy during these times of national emergency. Also part of rational theory when looking at the executive branches is how do they respond to media criticism. And here I'm going to focus on US President Donald Trump and UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Traditionally, presidents and prime ministers have tried to cultivate good relationships with the media. In the modern age, Trump and Johnson have taken a different approach which can be explained using rational theory. Both leaders adopt populist theories to win elections and subsequently harness the informal power of their officers to bypass the media. Trump used Twitter to commandeer the political agenda, and Johnson answered the people's prime minister's questions sent in by Facebook users. Trump pushed back against criticism from traditional media, dismissing it as fake news. His confrontational relationship with liberal news organizations led to him claiming the New York Times and the Washington Post were siding with China against the USA. These tactics were intended to bolster the distrust felt by many Trump supporters towards liberal news outlets and to defend him from attack. Johnson was also criticised for a confrontational relationship with the media and famously refused to be interviewed by Andrew Neil during the 2019 election campaign. After winning, he discussed the possibility of abolishing the BBC licence fee. Finally, we have cultural theory, which is the role of shared ideas and culture. This can come under many different ideas, starting with respect and presidential status. US political culture generally affords the President a greater degree of respect than the UK Prime Minister. As head of state and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, the President has an important ceremonial role. This is reflected in the grandeur of the White House and Air Force One. When a president's term ends, they retain the title of President for life and retire with the highest possible status. In contrast, when a Prime Minister retires, they continue to be a Member of Parliament. In recent years, respect for the presidency as an institution has eroded because of the increasing division within US politics. We can also look at cultural theory when looking at limited government versus parliamentary government. The US was created as an alternative to British rule, so hostility to an overly powerful government is at the heart of its political culture. In contrast, the office of the Prime Minister has evolved in the context of parliamentary government. Parliament's sovereignty has been rooted in British culture since the English Civil War and allows the Prime Minister to exercise enormous power with little restraint, provided that they maintain the support of Parliament. Furthermore, within Parliament, only the House of Commons can fundamentally block the Prime Minister's plans, whereas in the US, the President can face opposition from two independent chambers, the House and the Senate. Lastly, we have this idea of imperial versus presidential criticism. This also falls under the cultural theory role. The US public expect their president to act independently of Congress and take executive action when required. The president is only likely to be criticised for acting in an imperial fashion if they exceed the normal parameters of presidential authority. In the UK, public expectations of the Prime Minister are very different. Prime Ministers who do not follow a sufficiently collegiate approach with their cabinet colleagues are portrayed as domineering and often presidential. The expectation is that Prime Ministers work collaboratively with their cabinet ministers and their party within Parliament.